Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Jonathan Mostling. I'm Director of the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Keele. Welcome to everybody to our lecture here. This is the last of our Grand Challenge lectures for this year. They seem to have whisked by incredibly fast. I really cannot believe this is the last one for this year, but thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to a really enjoyable evening together. So this evening we're delighted to welcome our Grand Challenge speaker, Professor Jenny Reardon, for her lecture, which is entitled The Postgenomic Condition, Ethics, Justice and Knowledge After the Genome. The lecture, importantly, is presented in partnership with the Keele Race Equality Lecture Series. This series is an important strand of work that we've been undertaking here at Keele towards the Race Equality Charter, led by a dedicated team, including the co-chairs, in particular PVC for Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Shane O'Neill, who is here, joins us this evening, Dr. Sami Khan from the School of Psychology, along with a number of other colleagues, staff and students who are committed to the advancement of race equality. I know this isn't the first announcement, but I suppose we can announce it again because it's such good news. As often as we like. But we're very pleased to report that Keele has just been awarded a Race Equality Charter Bronze Award by Advance HE to recognise the university's commitment to tackling race equality in the Keele community and in higher education more broadly. In this, we join a group of only 12 other institutions that have been successful in achieving the award since it was launched in 2016. So that really is a really great accolade for the work that's been done, and so the credit to those that I've mentioned, that wider team across the university. So turning tonight to our speaker, Jenny. Our speaker, Jenny Reardon, is a professor of sociology and founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Jenny is currently undertaking a fellowship at the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies, so we're very lucky that she's been able to join us here on a busy schedule as you're across here in Europe at the moment. So thank you very, very much. Professor Reardon's training spans molecular biology, the history of biology, science studies, feminism and critical race studies, and the sociology of science, technology and medicine. And she brings understanding from these areas to bear on her work on monogenomic research. So the Institute prides itself on bringing together strands of interdisciplinary work in the widest possible way. And I have to say, reading from that list, I don't think you could have done any better in terms of your CV for qualifying for a lecture for one of our Grand Challenge lectures. Jenny is also co-author of The Race to the Finish, Identity and Governance in the Age of Genomics, and the book, The Postgenomic Condition, Ethics, Justice and Knowledge After the Genome. So in tonight's talk, Jenny will tackle the question of, can genomics be anti-racist? We were just reminiscing earlier on, because we both started our career in a similar way, although I think Jenny's is diverse in a far more exciting way than mine. But anyway, putting that aside, we both started our career staring at auto-rads and reading off individual base pairs from X-ray films and working out in painstakingly well, you're laughing because you did this as well. Yeah, you're old enough to remember. Painstakingly slow processes by which we could construct the genomic code, first of all around small organisms, and then eventually expanding to huge advances, ultimately being able to decode the human genome. In those days, it was incredibly exciting when those papers were published around the turn of the century, around 2000. I'm a parasitologist, so I remember the co-publication of the Plasmodium genome, the Anopheles genome, and the human genome, bringing all that together. But the human genome was a huge step forward. And now you can do it, what's the quickest you can do it? Certainly hours anyway. And you can stick it on a little sequencing thing on your laptop and you'll get the answer out. So it's all very boring at one level. But on the other level, it's incredibly exciting because it does reveal a huge amount of data, not just on an individual level, but on a population level. And I suspect, although I don't know, but that's where some of those challenges come in terms of the topics that Jenny's going to talk about tonight, that vast amount of genetic information that we have available to us, and the challenge that places us within society to curate and use that in a constructive and positive way. So just to welcome our speaker tonight, Professor Jenny Reardon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Institute for inviting me out, especially to Jo for everything she's done to bring it together, and all of you for coming out on what is a beautiful day, and I'm sure you'd rather be out there. So I want to begin just very quickly by just saying one more thing about my background, which might be useful, which you've already heard that I started out in genetics, sequencing DNA, and I was actually going to be a graduate student working on getting my PhD, working on a project that was known as the Human Genome Diversity Project. So when the human genome was being sequenced, a lot of biologists said that it might ruin biology, because what biology cared about was the diversity of life, and the Human Genome Project was sequencing only one human. And that project would go on very quickly actually be accused of being racist. A project more interested in collecting the blood of indigenous peoples than in their continued survival. That is a quick way to introduce you to the problem that I was introduced to very early on in my career, as I was a young budding scientist who wanted to do something good in the world. And one thing I often say to people is that I know very few people who go into biology with the goal of creating the next generation of racist science. And so how is it that this happened has been, one of the core things that I've tried to understand, and how can we do science differently such that the scientists who are engaged in the work achieve the goals that they want to achieve, which are often about anti-racism, about making the world a better place. So that's actually where my whole career has come out of those early experiences in these fields and facing those challenges, those grand challenges on the ground as a practicing person in science. But I'm going to start my talk today backing you up to a little bit in my second career, really, as a political theorist, historian of science. I'm going to begin with someone that some of you will know, some of you may not know, Hannah Arendt, who was a political theorist and public intellectual who moved from Germany during the Nazi era to come to the United States. She was one of the U.S.'s most important public intellectuals. She wrote a very noted book called The Human Condition, in which she worried in the preface of this book about the rise of mathematics and technological proof and what it would do to our ability to live a political life. Wrote Arendt in the preface of this book, "The trouble concerns the fact that the truths of the modern scientific worldview, though they can be demonstrated in mathematical formulas and proved technologically, will no longer lend themselves to normal expression in speech and thought. We do not yet know whether the situation is final, but it could be that we will forever be unable to understand, that is, to think and speak about the things which nevertheless we are able to do." Tonight, I will speak to you about the need to attend to Arendt's concern here as we address a problem, perhaps a grand challenge, that for millennia has confronted human societies, but that today takes on new dimensions in the wake of sequencing the human genome, which is, how should we think and speak about human differences, about what they will mean for how we understand one another and live together. So what should this mean? And this is an image of, this is taken from my latest book, which is a chronicle of the effort to make sense of the human genome sequence in the decade after the sequencing of the human genome and the challenges that presented. And what you're looking at here, every one of these dots is 50 nucleotides worth of data. And on this image, you had 750 million nucleotides represented. And I went into my office one day, and I have an office at our Genomics Institute, in addition to my office at the Sociology Department, which gives you a sense of my interdisciplinarity. And on the screen of my office mate, Mark, was this beautiful image, which I dubbed the Waterfall Image. And I said to Mark, "What is that?" And he said, "That is a big problem of interpretation." I was like, perfect, I'll have this for my book. This is, let me read to you what if you, in the back of the book, it will explain to you that this is a visualization of the short read sequencing alignments from the human H9 embryonic stem cell line aligned to the GRCH38 human genome assembly, visualized with the 1q21.1 region of chromosome 1. Now you all understand, right? Of course. And I think this partly introduces you to the problem that Arendt was trying to get at. We can say that, but what does that mean? So we can say it, what can it mean? And what I want to suggest is that the Human Genome Project, while it gave us the capacity to sequence all of this DNA, it did not build in the infrastructure for helping us to interpret it. And I won't go into the details of how that happened, but there were specific decisions that were taken that, in fact, led that to be the case. But what I want to suggest is that this problem of interpretation and the problem of creating the infrastructure for interpreting what all this stuff means has become a matter of, with some urgency, as this genetic information is now being taken up and used not just in laboratories, but out in societies to make sense of them, to do healthcare, but also to do things like forensics and to do police work and immigration control and these sorts of issues. We are now using this data. And the pressing nature of the problem of interpretation was made amply evident, at least in the United States, and also then quickly in Europe, when on March 23rd of 2018, last year, in the New York Times, there was an op-ed penned by a Harvard geneticist by the name of David Reich, who argued in this op-ed that the American public needed to, quote, get its collective heads out of the sand, unquote, and recognize that there were substantial biological differences between socially defined races. Now, for many who had believed the New York Times 18 years earlier, when it was publishing articles that said things like population geneticists prove that there's no such thing as race, this was a bit confusing. And it came as a bit of a shock. How was it that race was once again an object of genetic and genomics claims making? Had not population geneticists, as the race theorist Paul Gilroy claimed in this book called Against Race, proven that there was no biological meaning to race? As I want to explain to you tonight, the short answer is that is no, they had not. Great debates existed in the past and today amongst population geneticists about the value and proper place of race in studying human genetic differences. And both scientists and the broader publics have failed to develop the critical capacities needed to speak with one another about this critical matter. And tonight I want to basically explain how that became the case, and also to provide an analytic frame needed to understand both how we got here, but also what we might do about it. And all of my work, and partly as my work as the director of the Science and Justice Research Center, the point is not just to describe the problems, the point is to suggest what we can do to address them. So what I want to do is provide you with a little bit of a history lesson in a way, bring you way back to 1950, another very important point when we were debating what race had to do with science right after World War II, when UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Science and Cultural Organization, got involved in this debate, and this became a global issue at that time. Then we'll fast forward to right after the sequencing of the human genome, when these issues became very, very salient again, because after the Human Genome Project, everyone knew that the next thing that people were going to want to do was to sequence all kinds of different human genomes, raising this problem, and then finally ending with the New York Times op-ed. And in each of these cases, there will be different ways in which scientists make the arguments about race and genetics. But one thing that stays the case in every instance is that there is the promise that scientists are going to provide us with a precise definition of race. And this is not open to interpretation. There simply was going to be, UNESCO suggested, that you could provide, a scientist could give you the answer to whether or not race was meaningful or not meaningful. However, in each case, this promise could not be fulfilled. Scientists simply did not agree about the meaning and proper uses of race, and they largely failed to create the space to speak about those differences. Now, Angela Saini points out in her new book that maybe some of you may know about, that just came out this week, Superior, The Return of Race Science, that the current political moment, the rise of the alt-right in the United States, the rise of nationalist parties here in the United Kingdom and across Europe, have allowed for a kind of resurrection of race science. I think this is indeed the case. However, I would argue that the problem goes a bit deeper, and that the problem is part of a more general failure of speech, the undermining of collective capacities for scientists and citizens alike to speak to one another about the proper ends and practices of knowing and living together in this world. The invocation and use of genomics by white nationalists should deeply concern us. However, it is the failure, I think, of scholars, citizens, and scientists to recognize and speak together about the questions genetics and genomics raises about who and what ought to have the authority to define human differences and for what ends, that opens the door wide open to this return of race and the production of what I'm going to describe as irresponsible science. And what I mean by this is quite literally is science that we do not know how to respond to. And I'll explain this more as I go along tonight. Now, these are not trivial matters in an age bent on producing novel technologies for differentiating humans and increasing anxieties about which human differences will matter and for what ends. Technologies for detecting human genetic differences recently justified the first use of race, or Rasse, by the German state since World War II. It had been taboo in Germany to use genetic differences to say anything about group-level differences amongst human beings until just last year when the Bavarian Bundestag passed legislation saying that it could be used for forensics work. And increasingly, claims about genetic differences are being used to justify discriminatory claims in this country and around the world. I hope by the end of the talk you will have some historical context and some analytics that can help you to make sense of these developments and to begin to think about what might be done. And I will conclude by reflecting on how we might do better and produce what I would describe as responsible accounts of genomics and race. Okay, first episode. The problem of race and racism presented itself particularly acutely following World War II. Nazi theories of race hygiene had justified, of course, the slaughter of millions. Millions more perished on the battlefields fighting for the quote-unquote free world. In the wake of these atrocities, the question that was presented to across Europe and across the world was, how are we going to put the world back together again? And there were no clear answers. The Great and Terrible War delivered powerful blows to the credibility of nation-states. The United States, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world itself, had compromised its legitimacy through the subjection of millions of its citizens to subhuman treatment in the Jim Crow South. This is segregation that some of you may know about that persisted in the U.S. Far into the 20th century, and also the segregated North. Many disciplines of science also were tarnished. Physicists felt disillusioned. How, many of them asked, had so many become enrolled in the production of the most deadly weapon ever produced, the atomic bomb? The problem of how to know and live in the world at this time presented formidable challenges. Now, while there were many differences of opinions about what to do, one thing many agreed on: the new institutions of governance and knowledge should not divide, but rather, through an embrace of universal principles, they should unite. The United Nations formed in the January of 1946, declaring in its charter faith and fundamental human rights. And I've actually been doing some archival work at UNESCO right now, and it's extremely moving to read the founding documents of UNESCO, where people were imagining that in 40 years there would be no nations. We would be living under this grand, United Nations. It's hard to imagine in this moment of Brexit and nationalism that is upon us today as you all are voting in the European elections. So to implement this vision, the United Nations invested faith in the power of education, culture, and science. That was a question mark, science to begin with. Importantly, to begin with, there was no S in UNESCO. It was UNESCO, the United Nations Organization for Educational and Cultural Reorganization. And the reason was exactly because people were questioning whether or not science could play a role in peace after the atomic bomb. Yet at the end of the day, advocates for science prevailed, and in December of 1946, the first General Assembly of the United Nations, the UNESCO UNESCO convened. Sorry. And now one of UNESCO's first and most celebrated actions was the production of an expert statement on race. Has anybody heard of these statements in the room? Okay, one person it seems. As part of the United Nations effort to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in 1948, the UN Social and Economic Council assigned UNESCO the task of gathering and disseminating facts that could combat racial prejudice. The early leaders of the UN expressed faith in science to overcome discrimination and to unify. Quote, "Science and the scientific way of thought," the first director of UNESCO, Julian Huxley, proclaimed, "is as yet the one human activity which is truly universal." So the idea here is we're going to create a new regime, a new political regime in which we're not citizens of nations, but we're all human beings. And the scientific evidence for that is going to be provided that's going to prove that we're all one, and we are all human beings. That was the idea. Yet, as UNESCO was about to discover, scientists did not speak with one unified expert voice. While the first UNESCO statement on race, issued in 1950, this statement here, this first statement, which proclaimed that mankind was one, that there were no meaningful differences among human beings when it came to important traits like mental capacities, it received positive press coverage in public media outlets like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. Tens of thousands of the copies of this statement were distributed around the world by the mass media production capacities of UNESCO. But despite this, it provoked passionate opposition from many physical and anthropologists, and particularly the anthropologists here in the United Kingdom. In the pages of the journal Man, for example, British anthropologists presaging David Reich by nearly 70 years argued that the statement had irrationally disbarred mental and emotional traits from racial analysis and confused race as a biological fact with the quote-unquote concept of race as a social phenomenon. Worried that the criticism would undermine the credibility of the statement as well as the newly formed UNESCO, within a few months, Alfred Matrot, here pictured, the head of the social sciences department at UNESCO, convened a second group of experts to come to UNESCO House in Paris. This time comprised primarily of geneticists and anthropologists, so they didn't include any sociologists and anthropologists like they did the first time around. Matrot sent the second statement out for comment before publication, having learned his lesson last time when he had published a statement and then heard what people thought. And he received such a range of responses to this statement that he didn't publish it as a statement, but as a book with 60 responses along with it from scientists around the world. The effort left those involved distraught. The eminent American geneticist, Leslie Clarence Dunn, confided that the process had left him, quote, harassed and sick. Even the ever-diplomatic Matrot expressed exasperation that no one had informed him of the diversity of views among anthropologists and geneticists before he convened his effort. Despite the bitter disagreements among scientists, though, amazingly, UNESCO persisted in its belief that scientific facts at the end of the day about race could be gathered and that public dissemination of these facts could help fight racism. As part of their efforts, they actually produced a children's book. This one, What is Race? I'm not really sure which children they were thinking of, but actually they were thinking more of high school age folks. The text of the first edition was written by Dunn and illustrated by the prominent American-born but Paris-based illustrator Jane Eken, pictured here. Now, once again, though, controversy ensued. The U.S. State Department asked that the first edition of this children's book not circulate on the basis that it contained, quote, inaccurate and misleading information about the race problem in the United States. The second edition attempted to respond to the critique by carefully stating that the book's conclusions did not bear upon the problem of race relations, basically saying this is not politics, this is science. Published under the name What is Race? The second edition did, however, continue to present UNESCO's vision of science as the source of clear truths that could fight racism. Indeed, this book began with a quiz, which you all now can take. Race is a difficult word. Which of the following would you call races? So yeah, you can mark down your answers now and I'll show you the answers later. So Mediterraneans, a race, Aryans, Australians, yes or no? There were answers. Throughout the book, the new science of genetics represented through the pictorial form of the isotype. This is interesting because remember, this is a time when people believed that we were going to have one world, but we might not speak the same language, but we could all read the same images. And the isotype was about trying to communicate across different nations. These isotypes are supposed to present these universal truths. For example, the mixing of human beings means there are no pure races. That's what this one is supposed to represent. And then this one, intelligence is shaped by environment, and there is, quote, no hereditary or biological reason for assuming that some races have less aptitude for learning. So if the wind is blowing and there's a bunch of microbes, you're not going to do as well as if you've got healthcare and there's no wind blowing trash around. And the book promises precise answers to the questions of race. Following the quiz is this explanation and instruction. And by the way, the answers are down here. So for those of you who were following along, Australians, I like this one, yes and no. Mediterraneans, yes. Aryans, no. You figure out the logic behind that. But what I want to call out here is what it explains right after you take the quiz. It says, as you can see, the word race is a difficult one to use correctly, but because false ideas of race have caused so much human and social damage, it is important that we should be as precise about its meaning as possible. These UNESCO documents powerfully shaped how generations would learn about the meaning of race from a scientific perspective. Indeed, when I was in graduate school, these statements were presented as the end of race in science. They marked the end of the history. There was no history of race in science after 1950 because these statements were held to end them. The statements were also cited in the Supreme Court cases that ultimately ended segregation of schools in the United States. And they played a large role in rehabilitating genetics, human genetics, in the post-World War II era and positioning this field as an anti-racist force. The UNESCO statements also importantly established that it was possible to construct a popular narrative that there was a unified understanding of race amongst scientists, even as those very same scientists bitterly fought over its meaning. So what you had was a public presentation of some statement like this: our research cannot be used to support racism. It shows there are no inferior or superior races. But then behind the scenes, you get a lot of different views playing out. Human groups differ profoundly in their innate capacity of intellectual and emotional development. Now that person might believe, this is Ronald Fisher, now he might believe this, a very important British statistician. He might believe this, and think there are no inferior or superior races, but still believe this. And then there were others who thought, you just can't use our research to say anything about what happens in society. This is science. It has nothing to do with society. So there's all kinds of views out there that are consistent with this, but lots of bickering going on behind the scenes. And this also creates a problem because, indeed, there were people who didn't agree with this as well. They did think that there were inferior and superior races. But it became impossible to speak about these differences. The UNESCO statements created a problem that would haunt genetics for decades to come, and that is that geneticists could no longer speak about which they nevertheless did, hearkening back to Arendt. Let's see how that plays out in episode 2. This fast-forwarding about 50 years later to right after the sequencing the Human Genome Project. We all know that what we want to do is sequence all kinds of human beings all around the world. In fact, we don't want to stay in the United States, although to begin with, people said, let's just stay in the US. We're a melting pot. We don't be accused of going out and plundering the DNA of other nations. But then China said there's no way, no, actually Japan said no way, is the US going to make the next generation of human genes, the human genome map, and not include us? So that became racist and exclusionary. And so at the end of the day, they went to Ibadan, Nigeria, and they went to, some samples came from Utah, and samples came from both Tokyo and Beijing. Those were the places that they came from. And it was called the International HapMap Project. But as this was getting going, these organizers were very well aware of the debates that circulated around the Human Genome Diversity Project, which I told you about, this project that got accused of being the vampire project. Here are all the declarations. These are, actually, this is not all. This is like a tiny fragment of the declarations issued by indigenous organizations against the Human Genome Diversity Project. This scarred the scientists involved. As maybe you can empathize, it is not an easy thing to be accused of being racist, particularly if what you think you're doing is anti-racist work. And so this left a lasting mark on the scientists involved, and NIH was very careful to try to avoid this problem. And at the very same time, you had the bell curve coming out. How many of you know about the bell curve in this room? A few of you? Okay, this was a big a book in the United States, a bestseller, and it argued that, by Herrnstein and Murray, in which they argued that genetic differences between races could be used to explain differences in educational attainment, and also argued that therefore there was no, that we shouldn't be putting resources into educating folks who had this innate inability to perform as well as others. And as you can imagine, very, very controversial. Now, so much work had been done since World War II to restore trust in genetic studies of human differences, but the question on the minds of people at the National Institutes of Health was, would that work? And the very possibility of a genomic account of human differences be undone before that research had even started. This was a serious threat. In the wake of this threat, scientists who studied human genetic differences set out to correct the record. Luca Cavalli-Sforza, who was the population geneticist, who was the founding father of the Human Genome Diversity Project, in an address delivered to UNESCO in 1994, argued that critics misunderstood the Diversity Project, that far from advancing racism, it would counter it through demonstrating that race was a social ideology, not a biological reality. So now we're back to UNESCO again. 1950 debates. Despite these claims, however, many researchers had no intention of abandoning racial categories. Indeed, in the wake of the prominent reporting that race was not real that I showed you earlier, Natalie Angers from the New York Times publishing this piece, some geneticists and epidemiologists began to argue that the view that the concept of race was biologically meaningless did not derive from a, quote, objective scientific perspective. and a slew of reports, reporting in the media as well, this is Nicholas Wade, began to argue that there was a genetic reality to race. Genome scientists, it became very clear, would not be able to calm anxieties about the racist potential of their research through arguing that race had no biological reality and that that was simply the truth of the matter. As in the case of the UNESCO statements, there was no consensus available amongst scientists about the utility of race amongst practicing geneticists. And in the wake of these quite prominent disagreements, some prominent scientists began to admit that their use of race lacked precision. Indeed, quite shockingly, at 3 of the talks that I saw Francis Collins, who was the head of the effort to sequence the human genome in the United States, 3 of the talks he gave at the beginning of the new millennium in the US, he began to invoke the words of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Harvard professor of history and African American studies. And Higginbotham's quote in which she says, "When we talk about the concept of race, most people believe that they know it when they see it, but arrive at nothing short of confusion when pressed to define it." And Collins used this quote to argue that, we too were perplexed about race, which was kind of amazing to hear this, actually. It was like a moment of where there was a break in this narrative had been there for decades, in which the claim was, yes, as scientists we can tell you the truth, but actually no, we're confused too. And he broke away from this scientist knows best approach. And his institute began to fund an unprecedented number of social scientists to help the genome scientists with their confusion. And to sort out the confusion, NIH decided to grant power to people themselves to decide how to define and order them for the purposes of genetic study, to not grant that power to scientists. So at a background and overview document distributed in September 2002 for the International HapMap Project, this was what the HapMap organizers put forward, that communities themselves will ultimately decide the exact description or label by which they wish samples from their population to be identified. So we as scientists are not going to do that. We're not going to say these are African or these are anything. You guys are going to decide. We're going to collect the blood from you, and then you tell us what to put on those test tubes. What do you think happened? I'm getting curious. I wish we had more time. We could discuss that. But however, rather than the intent, let's just say it didn't turn out as they had hoped. Rather than the intended effect of shifting power from scientist communities, the practice unwittingly shut down speech once again and opened the door once again to the irresponsible return of race. So now, how did this happen? Through, I argue, the return of the discourse of precision. With what they viewed as the political task of representation safely allocated over to communities, it became possible for the project organizers to imagine that they engaged in what they actually described as the quote-unquote a precise approach to naming population. Indeed, precision in naming populations formed the central principle in these guidelines for referring to populations that the project put out. And project leaders credited this innovation to social scientists. However, the trope of precision, of course, goes way back, as we already denoted in the UNESCO statements. But 50 years later, HapMap organizers invoked precision to ward off the problem of race. And there were things that should be gained from this new commitment to precision. So the genome scientists learned that the Yoruban do not exist, the Yoruba do. They became sensitive to the problems of generalizing to categories like Africans, Europeans, and Asians. And so what ended up happening is, although they rejected the name, so communities would come back, people would come back. There was a group in southern Italy that came back and said, we want to be called traditionally red. Red for communists, red for wine, and red for blood. And it didn't go over well, the NIH. So then they went back and they came up with some other names. They also got rejected. And so in the end, they had to go with the name that the NIH wanted, but they could have it also in their local language. And NIH wanted names like, Yoruba in Ibadan, Nigeria. That was an actual name. And they didn't say from, because they actually debated all this stuff quite in detail. It wasn't from, because you might be in Ibadan, but not from Ibadan. So it was the Yoruba in Ibadan, Nigeria, or YRI. And that was the precise definition, okay? So, so there were, I think, positive benefits to this approach. But there were also some significant costs. The investment in a so-called precise and objective approach to naming rendered it impossible for HapMap scientists to, in practice, speak about their own representational practices. So consider the following explanation one project organizer gave me of the problem HapMap researchers faced when describing who they had collected samples from when they went to Ibadan, Nigeria. Something that we always in the HapMap, in this project, had to be careful about is that we are not studying Africa, obviously, because Africa is a very diverse place with lots of populations. And that is why we tried to be very careful when we talk about the sample we did, which was from the Yoruba, that this is for the Yoruba, right? And it's not even all the Yoruba. It is the 90 DNA samples from the Yoruba we had. So according to this HapMap organizers, the 90 people sampled in Ibadan, Nigeria only represented those 90 people. Now, while I don't want to contend that you ever can have complete coherence ever in anything, I do want to suggest that it makes no sense to suggest that the US government went to Ibadan, Nigeria, spent millions of dollars to find something out about 90 people. The critical questions were, who did these 90 people represent? How large of a group? What kind of a group? But however, HapMap researchers found themselves in a bind, unable to speak about these central aspects of their research. Through drawing a line between science and politics, between representation and science, and rhetorically placing the power to name with communities, they backed themselves in a corner. They no longer were able to speak about that which they nevertheless did, and the result was an irresponsible science, a science that they could not practically respond to. So while unable to openly speak about this, and I will come back to the qualities and significance of speech in my conclusion, in practice, those who did this work did answer the question about who the 90 people represented. So in, for example, this Nature 2008 paper, in the very title, it reports proportionally more deleterious genetic variation in European than in African populations. Now, while in the methods supplement for the paper, they very carefully use YRI, the Yoruba in Ibadan, Nigeria, when it came to the title and the discussion in the paper, they revert back to Europeans and Africans. And they do generalize. In some, HapMap leaders' attempts to grant, and this was by no means a unique example. In some, HapMap leaders attempt to grant, quote unquote, people powers. Oh, I should also say that for some of the scientists that I talked to, and the basis of this work, by the way, is my interviewing of over 30 scientists who were involved in the organization of HapMap, attending these meetings, being involved in these debates over the course of the planning of the HapMap project. And a couple people actually said to me that they thought that the whole approach to naming and using this precise approach was simply political correctness. In some, HapMap leaders' attempts to grant people powers to accurately define themselves inadvertently disempowered both scientists and communities alike, because it made it nearly impossible for project organizers to speak openly about their own representational practices and made them susceptible to unwittingly reinscribing racial categories. In short, they fell into the all too familiar pattern in which liberal practices of freedom, in this case, self-determination, participate in unacknowledged constructions of race. And this problem is well articulated in the works of Ann Stoler and Joan Wallach-Scott and others as well, but these are two that I think I would point you to. So, third episode, New York Times and the David Reich op-ed. How many of you saw this op-ed? Okay, some of you do know. All right. And the book. Oh, and the book. Yeah, how many of you know the book? Read the book. Okay. It is the disempowerment felt by population geneticists, I think, that we must keep in mind if we are to understand this current moment, a moment marked by the Reich editorial. Under the heading, How Genetics is Changing Our Understanding of Race, Harvard geneticist David Reich argued in March of last year, as I mentioned at the start of my lecture, that there were in fact substantial differences between human groups that correspond to races, including, and this is where Reich said something that no one else had dared to say in recent decades, including cognition and behavior. While Reich recognized that with this claim he might be leaving many feel uncomfortable, and he was indeed correct about this, he argued if scientists are not allowed to speak these uncomfortable truths, and you've got to think about this op-ed in the context of the Trump post-truth era of politics in the US. So if scientists are not allowed to speak these uncomfortable truths, worse and truly racist claims would fill the gap. And I'm not going to repeat them, but you can read them in the article. In his op-ed, Reich is responding, I argue, to years of population geneticists feeling backed into a corner, unable to speak about that which they do. And on this point, he is indeed correct. And I applaud his efforts to set the record straight. I was actually waiting for this to happen, watching the histories. I was like, this isn't going to hold. So, however, there remains a significant problem. Reich's truth remains an irresponsible one. That is, it is still unable to respond to the deeper problems. Why? First, Reich relies on the same straw figures of the scientists and of truth that produced the confusion about race and genetics in the first place. So this whole scientist knows best, I don't know if you know in the American sitcom, Father Knows Best. This is my reworking of that to Scientist Knows Best. So this figure, this straw figure of scientist knows best and who produces truth, and the scientist who produces the truth that shall set us free. Belief in these figures keep Reich from the very speech he, I think, purportedly desires. Consider this. If Reich wanted discussion, he got the opportunity for it on March 30th when BuzzFeed, after the New York Times refused to publish it, published a response to the op-ed signed by 67 natural and social scientists. And these scholars, which included geneticists, epidemiologists, sociologists, anthropologists, lawyers, and for full disclosure, I played a rather large role in the writing of this. This statement argued that Reich failed to understand the critiques of the use of race in genomics, that the critics of those who were critiquing the use of race in genomics were not denying the existence of differences among human beings. What they were doing was saying that we must recognize the political and social origins of the categories that we use in biology, including race, and how these categories both reveal and conceal. As the BuzzFeed response states, sickle cell anemia is a meaningful biological trait. In the United States, it is commonly and mistakenly identified as a black disease. In fact, while it does have a high prevalence in populations of people with West and Central African ancestry, it also has a high prevalence in populations from much of the Arabian Peninsula and parts of the Mediterranean and India. This is because the genetic variant that causes sickle cell is more prevalent in people descended from parts of the world with a high incidence of malaria. Race has nothing to do with it. So we could potentially organize our medical system differently and use different categories and have a category that refers to people who grew up in regions or live in regions that are in Mediterranean climates. It's not the way we do it, but we could. It's not a fundamental truth of nature that malaria is linked to African Americans. When a BBC reporter asked Reich about the BuzzFeed response, he did not respond to the substance of the criticism. Instead, he mobilized that now 65-year-old figure of the geneticist as the truth warrior, a brave soul who saved civilization from racism and the muzzling of free speech associated with dictators. States Reich, I'm actually very pleased to be part of introducing this discussion. I think that scientists have been anxious about discussing differences among populations in public fora, even though all the work that we do is about differences among populations and learning their history. Now, again, I agree that it's true that there was lots of discomfort about discussing this, but but actually, before I say this, I want to also say that the BBC reporter further explained that Reich stressed the need for, quote, scientists to take charge of the narrative lest they hand the initiative to those with less benign intentions. So while it's true that, yes, it was uncomfortable, it's certainly Reich was not the first person to introduce this discussion. But here in the op-ed, Reich positions himself as a courageous hero who dares to speak the truth. And this is also how he was being presented in the German-speaking press, which is where I was when this op-ed was first published. So in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, there was an article by Axel Meyer, and in Neue Zürcher Zeitung by Mark Shashar. These were evolutionary biologists who basically said, finally, we've always known that this was political correctness. Now, finally, we can talk about race in Germany and Switzerland. And this is how it was being mobilized. It was also picked up by white nationalists in the United States. But this is a truth that is unable to respond to critique, I would argue, and one that obscures the richer reality. As even my all too brief presentation of the history to you today of these debates about what race should mean and can mean when we're looking at genetics, Reich did not, by any means, as he claims, introduce the discussion about race and genetics. And in those prior discussions, while calling for precision, these geneticists failed to agree on the correct definition and approach to race. Not all population geneticists agreed with Reich's op-ed. There were those who joined in with us in writing the BuzzFeed piece. There were others who talked about writing their own response. In short, Reich did not speak about that which his fellow scientists nevertheless did. And it is this inability to speak about that which we nevertheless do, especially in this consequential domain of using genetics to sort human beings for the purposes of knowing and governing them, that has created, I suggest, an opening for the rise of racist and nationalist uses of genetics. What can be done? First, we must resist the temptation, which is strong, and I think in the US right now, to embrace the figure of the warrior of truth who fights the forces that threaten to shut down discussion. In the age of Donald Trump and the rise of the alt and ultra-right, it is tempting indeed to embrace the simple righteous narrative. However, I hope that as I've demonstrated tonight, therein lies the beginning of a new, more insidious form of silencing. We require instead new collectivities that gather diverse perspectives, not to engage in mere talk about race and genetics. And I want to note that this is interesting. The New York Times published, over 800 people wrote in response to this op-ed, and the New York Times, titled its piece, How to Talk About Race and Genetics. And we titled our piece, How to Not Talk About Race and Genetics. And we actually didn't talk to each other about what we were titling our pieces. This is how it turned out. Despite what some of the commentaries said. But in the wake of watching how this all played out, my position became that we need no more talk about race and genetics. What we need is speech in the Arendtian sense. Speech, the simple act of speaking about that which we do, Arendt argued, makes, quote, human togetherness possible. This speech differs from mere talk. The latter is instrumental, designed to fool a foe or dazzle with propaganda. You've probably seen a lot of it about in the public domain lately. The former is revelatory, designed to foster relationships and collective life. Importantly, it requires the presence of others who are different from one another. It is through speaking in the presence of others who are different from us that a common world, Arendt argued, forms. Speech, in this sense, is a form of articulation. It joins. So an articulation, this is an articulation, your forearm to your heart. So joining together is another form of articulation in speech. For Arendt, such speech also creates the grounds for judgment. It fosters thinking with others, what she described, referencing Kant, as an enlarged way of thinking that is fundamental to judgment. And judging, she writes, is one of, if not the most important activity in which the sharing the world with others comes to pass. We must, Arendt argued, think together in the presence of others who are different from us if we are to develop and retain collective capacities to judge, which I argue we must if we are not to devolve to brute rule or the worst instincts of the all too lawless internet where white nationalists have found haven. This is one of the ways in which these ideas have propagated is via these websites. And this is a new problem, I think, that we face in politics that we're increasingly, I think, becoming aware of. So how to do this, though, is far from a simple matter, but I want to end with a few examples for us to consider. The first is actually these efforts that are being made in various universities. One thing is I think we need to defend our universities as sites where we bring people together across difference. And this award that you all have just won indicates, I think, the commitment of this university to doing that. And I think we must defend that role of the university. It is one of the only places in society right now where we have where this is a sanctioned role. At the university that I'm at right now, Freiburg University in Germany, Professor Veronica Liphart has put together a group that is a collective of population geneticists, biologists, epidemiologists, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and mathematicians who have come together to call attention to the problems created by this law that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, the first use by the German state of population categories and in forensics work, in forensic DNA phenotyping in Germany. This group, which has been making public statements and giving testimony at the Bundestags as part of the legislative debates, are pointing out things like the problem that no database can claim to represent human genetic diversity in a balanced way, that the databases often use arbitrary and non-standardized reference population names, and that they put subjects into those population groups in non-standardized ways. So the idea here is you take DNA from a crime scene. You don't know who the person is. You want to take the DNA. You want to say, oh, that person's from Syria. Well, that person, one algorithm might put that person from Syria. Another algorithm might put that person in Pakistan. You know, these things are not cut and dry, just the truth. Just give me the truth. This group, organized by Professor Liphart, has been pushing for public debate and to create the space to debate and to speak about these very complex matters that are going to matter quite a great deal to the future of the German state. The final example I'll give is the Science and Justice Research Center that I direct. And here, over the last 10 years or so, we've been figuring out how to work together across our divides to address issues such as this one when they come up. So I was actually in Germany, as I said, when the op-ed came up. And my colleagues and I, we get together on Tuesdays evenings, actually for beers. And this is where we form actually these relationships that help us in moments like these. And I was gone, and they were writing to me saying, you have to come back. And when I did come back, we had this amazing session in which we were drinking beer, and we had a chalkboard behind us, and we were drawing. Any of you in evolutionary biology will know you draw trees. But it turns out, and I was turning around and putting my tree on the chalkboard, and a colleague of mine said, "Why does your tree have a curved line?" I was like, "Oh, is it supposed to be straight?" Yeah, it's supposed to be straight. And then other people started to draw their trees, and somebody said, your tree, your lines are too long. They should be shorter. And everybody had a different way of drawing the tree. It didn't matter whether or not it was two population geneticists talking about that, or most of these people were not social scientists. They were genome scientists. So making the point that there was something to be gained from having this conversation together to learn about how we understood this task of how do we represent human evolution, human genetic variation very differently. And thus began a very substantive conversation between us that continues today, and we've been talking about trying to create some curriculum around this together. So I conclude by saying what we require in these times are new collectivities like these that gather diverse perspectives, and like your institute, that gather diverse perspectives not to engage in mere talk about race and genetics, but rather speech in the Arendtian sense. We need this if, in this post-genomic era, knowledge and justice, and not race, are to have a robust future. Thank you.